It was a quiet evening, the kind that usually passed without anything unusual. The young waitress had just finished wiping the last table of the small restaurant where she worked. Her back ached a little from the long day, but she was used to it. She looked forward to heading home, taking off her apron, and resting her tired feet. As she stepped outside, the cool night air brushed against her face, and for a moment she closed her eyes to enjoy the silence. But then, just a few steps away, she noticed something that pulled her out of her calm mood. An elderly woman stood near the corner of the street. Her movements were slow, her eyes darting left and right as if she was searching for something, but couldn't find it. She clutched a small handbag against her chest, and her expression carried both fear and confusion. The waitress stopped walking, feeling an unexpected wave of concern. She watched the woman for a minute, hoping maybe a relative or friend would appear, but no one came. People passed by, glancing quickly before moving on. Too busy with their own lives to stop, the waitress couldn't just ignore her. She approached gently, not wanting to startle her. "Are you all right?" she asked in a soft, caring voice. The old woman turned her head slowly, her eyes watery and distant. She didn't answer right away, as if the words were caught somewhere inside her. After a moment, she whispered, "I don't know where I am." Her voice trembled, and the simple sentence carried a deep sadness. The young woman felt her heart sink. She remembered her own grandmother, who used to forget small things before she passed away. There was something familiar in the way this elderly woman looked lost in her own world. She reached out her hand carefully, giving her a reassuring smile. "It's all right. You're safe. Let's sit down for a bit." She guided the woman to a nearby bench, helping her sit. The woman clung to her hand tightly, as though afraid she would disappear. The waitress asked if she knew her address or if there was someone she could call, but the old woman only shook her head. She mentioned bits of things that didn't fit together, something about a garden, a blue gate, and a song her mother used to sing. None of it made sense. It became clear she was struggling with her memory. The waitress offered her some water from her bag, and the woman accepted it with shaky hands. For a brief second, she smiled, calling the waitress dear, and humming a tune that seemed to calm her down. It was such a fragile and tender moment that the young woman felt tears sting her eyes. She wondered how long the woman had been wandering alone like this, and how many people had walked past without stopping. As the night grew colder, the waitress knew she couldn't leave her there. She thought about her own tiredness, the long day she had already endured, but something inside her told her this mattered more than rest. "I'll help you," she promised softly. The woman squeezed her hand again, her eyes glistening like she understood the kindness, even if she couldn't find the right words. Waitress considered calling for help but feared the woman might panic if strangers in uniforms approached suddenly. So instead, she stayed by her side, speaking to her in a calm voice, asking gentle questions in hopes of finding a clue. At one point, the woman mentioned a son, but she couldn't recall his name. She talked about a big house, but no street or number came to mind. Her mind seemed like pieces of a puzzle scattered across the ground, impossible to put back together in that moment. The young woman felt a heaviness in her chest. She knew the world could be harsh, and people often chose to look away when faced with someone vulnerable. But tonight, she decided she wouldn't be one of those people. She had nothing to gain, no reason other than compassion. Yet something told her that sitting with this lost stranger was exactly what she was meant to do. As the city lights flickered above them, the waitress wrapped her jacket gently around the woman's shoulders, shielding her from the chill. The old woman leaned closer, as if finding comfort in the warmth and kindness of someone she had only just met. That small act of trust touched the waitress deeply. She couldn't explain it, but in that moment, she felt like life had placed her there for a reason. The streets continued to buzz faintly with cars and footsteps, but for the two of them, time seemed to slow. The waitress no longer thought of her tiredness or the hours she had already spent working. Instead, She thought only of keeping this fragile stranger safe until help could be found. She didn't know it yet, but this simple choice to stop, to care, to stay was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change her life forever. The night had grown late, and the streets were becoming emptier by the minute. The waitress sat on the bench beside the elderly woman, holding her hand gently so she wouldn't feel alone. The woman's breathing had calmed, but her eyes still wandered, restless and uncertain. Every now and then, she would murmur something about her garden or a song she used to sing as a child, but it was clear her memory was fragile, slipping in and out like the tide. The waitress knew she couldn't simply wait there all night. She glanced around, wondering what the best choice would be. Leaving the woman alone was out of the question. Calling someone from her own circle wouldn't help either. They had no idea who this woman was. At last, she thought about the police station nearby. They might have resources to track down the woman's family. But she also worried that the old woman might get frightened in an unfamiliar place. She looked into her eyes and spoke softly. "Would you like me to walk with you? We can go somewhere safe." The woman didn't reply with words but gave a small nod, as if sensing trust. Slowly, the waitress stood up and helped her to her feet. The woman leaned on her arm for support as they walked together down the quiet street. The waitress tried to keep the mood light, pointing out the glow of the street lamps or the way the breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from a bakery that had just started its morning work. The woman smiled faintly, humming the same tune she had been humming before. It was like walking with a child. She needed reassurance, patience, and care. When they reached the police station, the officers at the front desk were surprised to see the pair walk in. The waitress explained the situation as best as she could. The officers looked at the elderly woman with concern and gently asked her name, her address, or if she had any identification. But every question seemed to float past her. She couldn't give them anything clear. She clung even tighter to the waitress's hand, almost like she was afraid they might take her away. Seeing the worry in the woman's eyes, the waitress crouched down to her level and said in a calm voice, "It's okay. I'm right here with you. No one is going to hurt you." The old woman's grip loosened slightly, and she leaned her head against the waitress's shoulder for comfort. The sight moved even the police officers, who were used to dealing with all kinds of situations. The officers began checking their records, trying to find someone who matched the description. But it wasn't something that could be solved quickly. One of them mentioned it might take hours before they located her family or someone who knew her. The waitress could have left then. She could have thanked them and gone home to her warm bed, but instead she stayed. She knew that if she left, the woman might feel abandoned and more frightened than before. She bought a warm drink from the vending machine, offered it to the old woman, who smiled faintly and called her dear once again. They sat together in the waiting area, the elderly woman humming her lullaby softly while the waitress listened, nodding every now and then to keep her engaged. At one point, the woman told a broken story about her younger days, about dancing in the rain, about a house with white walls and roses by the window. The words were scattered, but the emotion behind them was clear. It was like her memories were locked behind a door that only opened a crack now and then. The hours passed slowly, but the waitress never grew impatient. She talked gently, told her little stories about her own day at work, about how she used to love the smell of fresh bread when she walked past a bakery as a child. The old woman laughed softly at that, as though she understood and shared the same memory. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her calm through the night. The officers, watching quietly from their desks, couldn't help but admire the patience and compassion of the young woman. One of them whispered to another, "Not many would sit here all night for a stranger." The other nodded, saying, "Kindness like that is rare." For the waitress, it didn't feel like an effort. It felt natural, as though helping the elderly woman was something she was meant to do. Hours melted away until the faint light of dawn began to break through the station windows. The city outside was waking up again, But inside, the two of them were still sitting together, an unlikely pair brought together by chance. The young waitress had no idea what the next day would bring. But as she sat with the frail woman humming softly beside her, she felt something stir in her heart. It was a quiet reminder that even small acts of kindness could mean everything to someone in need. She didn't know it yet, but her choice to stay by this woman's side was about to change her life in ways she could never have imagined. Morning sunlight slipped through the tall glass windows of the station, casting soft golden lines across the tiled floor. The young waitress rubbed her eyes, realizing she had been awake the entire night. Beside her, the elderly woman had dozed off for a little while, her head resting gently on the waitress's shoulder. It had been a long night filled with fragments of conversation, little smiles, and repeated reassurances, but despite the exhaustion, the waitress felt a strange sense of peace. She had done what she believed was right. Not long after the sun had risen, one of the officers approached with a relieved look. They had managed to find an address through community records and cross-checking old files. The woman did, in fact, have a home not too far away, though she lived with the help of caretakers. Hearing this news filled the waitress with both relief and concern. Relief that the woman had a place and people to look after her, and concern at how easily she had wandered off into the city streets without anyone. Realizing, when the waitress gently woke her, the woman stirred, blinking in confusion. "It's all right," the young woman said softly. "We're going to take you home now." The elderly woman nodded faintly, though she seemed unsure of what was happening. She held on tightly to the waitress's hand as they left the station, refusing to let go even when the officers offered their support. A car was arranged to take them to the address. During the ride, the elderly woman stared out the window, mumbling to herself about roses and blue fences, things that seemed pulled from old memories. The waitress sat beside her, keeping her calm with simple words and a gentle smile. She felt protective of her, almost as if she were her own grandmother. When the car turned onto a quiet street, the waitress's eyes widened. The houses were large and elegant, lined with carefully trimmed hedges and iron gates. It was a neighborhood far more luxurious than anything she was used to. The car stopped in front of a tall white house with wide windows and a garden that looked like it had once been lovingly cared for. The waitress could hardly believe that the woman she had found wandering lost in the city belonged here. As soon as they arrived, the front door opened and a middle-aged caretaker rushed out. Her face was filled with both relief and guilt as she hurried toward them. "Oh, thank goodness," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. She bent down beside the elderly woman, touching her arm gently. "Where have you been?" "We searched all night." The old woman looked at her blankly, then leaned into the waitress's side, still holding her hand as if afraid to be separated. The caretaker's eyes shifted to the young woman, taking in the tiredness in her face, the way she had clearly stayed all night by the woman's side. Emotion welled in her eyes. "Were you the one who stayed with her?" she asked softly. The waitress nodded, brushing it off as though it was nothing. "I couldn't just leave her alone. She seemed so scared." The caretaker shook her head in disbelief. "You don't understand how much this means. She's been slipping more often lately. She sometimes forgets where she is, who she's with. But to know someone cared enough to stay, to make sure she was safe, it's something we'll never forget." The waitress felt a bit shy under such gratitude. She tried to smile, saying, anyone would have done the same, but deep down, she knew that wasn't true. She had seen how people passed by the elderly woman in the street, too busy or too indifferent to stop. She hadn't been able to turn away, and that simple decision had led her here. As the caretaker guided the old woman inside, the elderly lady suddenly turned and looked at the waitress with surprising clarity. For a fleeting moment, her eyes were sharp and she whispered, "Thank you, dear." The words were simple, but they held a weight that made the waitress's heart ache. Then, just as quickly, the old woman slipped back into silence, allowing herself to be led inside. Before the door closed, the caretaker returned to speak to the waitress again. "You've done more than you realize. Her son is away right now, but when he hears what you've done, he'll want to thank you himself." The waitress shook her head quickly. She wasn't expecting anything. "Please, I didn't do this for thanks," she replied. "I just wanted her safe." Still, as she walked away down the quiet street, a strange feeling lingered in her chest. She had come to work the night before expecting nothing more than another long shift, another ordinary evening. But fate had placed her in the path of a stranger in need. She didn't know it yet, but the story wasn't finished. The old woman's family, especially her son, was about to change everything she thought she knew about her own life. Asterisk. The following day began just like any other for the young waitress. She tied her apron, greeted the early customers with a polite smile, and tried to push away the fatigue that still clung to her body after the long night she had spent helping the elderly woman. Though her mind drifted back to the encounter often, she reminded herself that she had simply done the right thing. Life would continue as it always did: busy shifts, small tips, and the quiet walk home afterward. But as the afternoon sun warmed the streets, something unusual happened. A sleek black car rolled up to the front of the restaurant. Its polished surface reflected the light, catching everyone's attention as it stopped by the curb. The engine purred to silence, and the door opened slowly. A tall, well-dressed man stepped out, his posture confident, his suit sharp and immaculate. Heads turned as he walked toward the entrance, his presence commanding respect even before he said a word. The waitress, carrying a tray of glasses, froze when she saw him. She had never seen someone like him walk into their modest little restaurant. He looked out of place, like he belonged in boardrooms and luxury hotels, not in a corner diner where the smell of frying eggs lingered in the air. Yet the man's expression wasn't one of superiority. It was intent, serious, as if he had come searching for something important. He approached the counter, and in a clear, steady voice, he asked for the waitress by name. Her co-workers glanced at her in surprise, whispering under their breath. She walked slowly toward him, unsure of what this was about, her heart thudding nervously in her chest. When she stood before him, he offered a respectful nod. "You're the one who stayed with my mother last night," he said firmly, though his tone was filled with emotion. The waitress blinked in shock. So this was the son the caretaker had mentioned. She hadn't expected him to come looking for her, certainly not in such a direct way. "Yes," she answered softly. I found her wandering. I couldn't leave her alone." The man's face softened. His eyes glistened with the weight of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "She means everything to me. And to know that someone like you, a stranger, cared enough to sit by her side all night. It's something I will never forget." By now, the restaurant had grown quiet. Customers had put down their forks, workers had stopped mid-task, all watching the scene unfold. The waitress shifted uncomfortably under the attention, wishing people wouldn't stare. "It wasn't a big deal," she murmured. "I just did what I thought anyone should do." But the man shook his head. "No, many walked past her. Many could have helped, but they didn't. You did. And that makes all the difference." His voice carried not just gratitude, but admiration. He then introduced himself, explaining that he was not just her son, but also a successful businessman who rarely had time to rest, let alone notice the fragility of life, until moments like this forced him to stop. "When the caretaker told me how you stayed by her side," he said, his voice lowering, "I realized that money, power, none of it compares to the simple kindness of a human heart." The waitress felt her throat tighten. She wasn't used to such words, especially directed at her. She had lived most of her life quietly, unnoticed, working hard to survive. And yet, here was this man, someone who seemed to hold the world in his hands, telling her that her small act of kindness meant more than she could ever imagine. For a moment, the silence in the restaurant was heavy with emotion. Then the man did something no one expected. He reached into his pocket, not for money, but for a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing a delicate piece of jewelry. "This belonged to my mother," he said softly. "She always said she wanted it to go to someone with a kind heart. I believe she would have wanted you to have it." The waitress's eyes widened in shock. She shook her head quickly. "No, I can't accept that," she whispered. "I didn't do it for a reward. I only wanted to help." He smiled faintly. "That's exactly why you deserve it." The customers, who had been holding their breath, began murmuring in awe. Some even wiped at their eyes. It was not every day they witnessed such a moment of pure humanity, wealth and status bowing before simple compassion. Waitress stood there, overwhelmed, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't take the box yet. She didn't know what to say. All she could feel was the weight of the moment, the sincerity in his eyes, and the knowledge that her life had just taken a turn she never expected. What she didn't realize then was that this meeting was only the beginning. The gratitude of this man, and the bond that had formed between them through the fragile thread of an elderly woman's trust, would open doors she never dreamed possible. The restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm after the man left, but the young waitress couldn't shake the moment from her mind. She kept replaying his words, the way his voice carried so much gratitude, the way he had looked at her as if she had done something extraordinary. All she had done was sit with a lost, frightened woman and make sure she was safe. To her, it had felt like nothing more than the right thing to do. But to him, it had clearly meant the world. That evening, as she walked home along the familiar cracked sidewalks, her thoughts kept drifting back to the elegant house, the caretaker's teary eyes, and the man's calm, commanding presence. She didn't imagine she would see him again. People like him belonged to a different world, a world of influence, power, and wealth. People like her belonged to the grind of long shifts, small wages, and quiet sacrifices. They were not meant to cross paths, but fate had other plans. The very next day, as she was preparing to begin another shift, the same sleek car pulled up again outside the restaurant. The staff murmured in surprise, rushing to peek through the windows, curious if he had come back. She froze when the door opened, and he stepped out once more, his expression determined yet warm. He walked straight up to her, ignoring the whispers and the curious eyes of the crowd. "I know you didn't do this for recognition," he said gently. "But my mother's safety means more to me than words can express. I can't just walk away without honoring the kindness you showed her." The waitress felt her cheeks warm. "Please," she said softly, "you don't owe me anything. I was just helping." The man shook his head firmly. "That humility is exactly why I want to do this. You may think it was small, but your compassion changed everything. My mother could have been hurt, lost forever. You gave me another day with her. You gave her comfort when I couldn't." His voice cracked slightly, revealing the son's deep pain and love. Then, to her shock, he offered her an opportunity that seemed impossible. He explained that he owned several businesses and had connections that could help transform her life. "I know you work hard," he said. "I see it in your eyes. But no one should have to struggle alone when they have a heart as generous as yours. Let me help. Whether it's supporting your studies, your family, or giving you a position in one of my companies, I want to give back a fraction of what you gave us." The waitress's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. She had never dreamed of such possibilities. All she had known was working late hours, counting tips to cover bills, and hoping life would one day feel a little less heavy. And now, in front of her, stood a man who could change everything with a single decision. Her first instinct was to refuse. She didn't want him to think she had done it for gain. But then she remembered the long nights of worry, the sacrifices her family had made, and the way opportunities had always seemed just out of reach. Maybe this was life's way of giving her a chance she had never dared to ask for. With tears forming in her eyes, she finally nodded, her voice trembling. If this is truly what you want, then thank you. Not for the money, not for the position, but for seeing me." The man smiled, and in that moment, the gap between their two worlds seemed to disappear. He wasn't just a businessman, and she wasn't just a waitress. They were two people bound together by a night of kindness, a fragile old woman's trust, and the power of compassion. Word spread quickly through the small community about the waitress who had changed her life simply by stopping to help. Customers who had once overlooked her began to treat her with respect, and her co-workers looked at her with admiration. But to her, the greatest reward wasn't the opportunities, the respect, or even the wealth that followed. It was the quiet knowledge that she had made a difference when it mattered most. She would never forget the fragile hand that had clung to hers that night, or the whispered "thank you" that had pierced through the fog of confusion. That moment, more than anything else, reminded her that kindness was never wasted. It always came back, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in life-changing ones, and so her life was no longer the same. One simple act of compassion had led her to a future brighter than she could ever have imagined. What had begun as a tired waitress walking home late at night ended as a story of kindness rewarded, a story that proved a single choice could change everything forever.